Her daughter called her the guilt budget. Her grandson laughed, then packed leftovers. By month's end, their names were gone, from the will, the accounts, the house. She didn't raise her voice. She raised documents. The trust was sealed. The eviction, quiet, and the woman they dismissed as a burden? She became the one asset they could never touch. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The table was set with care, as always. Linen napkins folded into fans. Eleanor's mother's old silver polished earlier that morning. A casserole rested in its baking dish, steam curling up toward the overhead light. Her peach cobbler, Logan's favorite, cooled beside the window, its crust golden and bubbled at the edges. Eleanor sat opposite her daughter and grandson, letting the rhythm of the meal speak for itself. Amber was picking at her chicken, her phone screen lighting up every few minutes with new alerts. Logan scrolled without apology, earbuds tucked loosely around his neck, one hand shoveling mashed potatoes onto his plate like he was timing himself. The clinking of silverware, the scrape of ceramic, everything else was silence. So Amber said suddenly, setting down her fork with a sigh, "We've got to trim the guilt budget somehow." Eleanor looked up slowly, unsure she'd heard right. Amber didn't clarify. Logan snorted. "You are kind of the guilt budget, Grandma," he said, grinning over his glass of soda. "You know, the reason we feel obligated to show up, chip in, smile for photos." Eleanor didn't speak. She reached for the pitcher and refilled Amber's glass with lemonade. Amber blinked. "Mom, don't take it personally. It's just we're juggling so much. Logan's got student loans coming due. My business overhead is insane, and we're trying to make things sustainable long term. That includes family planning too." "Sustainable," Eleanor echoed softly, folding her napkin. "Yes," Amber said, missing the tone entirely. "We're not 20 anymore. We can't keep prioritizing out-of-date expectations. Logan's future comes first now." He leaned back with a lazy smile, arms behind his head. "We appreciate everything, though." The cobbler remained untouched. After they left, Logan with a full Tupperware in one hand, Amber air-kissing the side of Eleanor's cheek like she was already halfway back in the car. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a while. The porch light cast a dim circle across the walkway, not quite reaching the curb where Amber's SUV idled, with music pulsing faintly behind the tinted glass. She didn't wave, she didn't move. Only after the car turned the corner did she return inside. The plates were still on the table. Logan's had a smear of peach filling. Amber's knife lay across her napkin, unused. Eleanor washed the dishes slowly, drying each one by hand. Then she made herself a cup of tea. When the call from Helen came 20 minutes later, she didn't answer right away. She stared at the screen, at the name that had anchored her for decades. Finally, she pressed accept. "Well?" Helen asked without greeting. "How'd the charm offensive go?" Eleanor didn't respond at first. Then she said, calm as still water, "Amber called me her guilt budget." There was a silence on the other end, short, sharp, then tight with rage. "She said that to your face?" And Logan laughed. Helen exhaled, deep and measured. "Cut your losses, sweetheart." There was a pause. Then Helen added, "Colder now." Then cut deeper. Eleanor set her tea down without drinking it. The clock ticked on the wall above her, and across the room, the file cabinet drawer creaked slightly open. Not from the wind, not from chance, because she had already pulled it once that day, hesitated, then closed it again. Now she reached for the handle with full intention. The file cabinet gave a reluctant click as Eleanor pulled the drawer open. The scent of paper and ink drifted out, faintly metallic, quietly dusty. Decades of order rested inside. Every tax return, every mortgage receipt, every tuition stub and forgotten invoice. No one had touched this drawer but her. She sat at the kitchen table beneath the overhead bulb, the same one Amber once helped her install back when help didn't come with ledger lines. The first checkbook ledger she pulled out had a small daisy sticker on the front, faded and peeling, a detail Eleanor had added to cheer herself up the week her husband passed. She didn't linger on the memory. Instead, she cracked the spine. Each page was dated and clean, neatly looped figures in dark blue ink, the kind of precision only a lifelong teacher would still bother maintaining even in retirement. She ran her finger down one column from a decade ago and stopped at an entry labeled Clemson University Deposit, Logan. The number stared back. $84,000, distributed over 4 years, tuition, books, housing, spring breaks, he never called her from. She flipped to another book. Amber's bakery debacle unfolded in bleeding red ink, $52,000 in wire transfers, first labeled bridge support, later temporary float, finally final bailout, never repaid. The receipts followed, new ovens, storefront lease, branded packaging. Eleanor remembered Logan complaining once that the croissants were dry. The bakery had closed in under a year, and then came the renovation folder. Handwritten line items. Amber insisted were necessary when she supervised the kitchen remodel. The faucet Eleanor never wanted. The marble countertops she barely used. $23,000 paid in full. All written as gifts, none received as such. She pulled out a fresh notebook, leather-bound, firm spine. She wrote the title on the first page in block letters, extracted without thank. Below it she began 3 columns. Name, purpose, amount. She wrote slowly, deliberately. Logan Quinn. College tuition, $84,000. Amber Quinn. Business bailout, $52,000. Amber Quinn. House renovation, $23,000. She paused, then added one more line. Eleanor Quinn. Gratitude received, $0. The numbers weren't what stung. It was the paper trail of generosity rewritten into obligation. The way love had been laundered through receipts and returned with interest charges and guilt. The front door creaked slightly as Helen let herself in. Eleanor had texted her just 3 words an hour earlier. Come. Now. Quiet. Helen didn't speak when she entered. She only set down her purse and removed her coat, folding it over the back of a chair. When she saw the open ledgers, her face tightened. You're doing the math. I needed to see it. In ink. Not just memory. Helen leaned over the table, eyes scanning the numbers. Damn. Eleanor didn't smile. Do I show them? Helen straightened slowly. No, sweetheart. She touched Eleanor's shoulder firm, not soft. Don't show them, she said again, quieter this time. Show the lawyer. Eleanor didn't answer, but her pen moved again. She turned to a blank page. At the top she wrote, Phase 2, Detachment. The law office didn't look like a place for battle. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, the kind of quiet elegance that made people sit straighter without knowing why. Eleanor walked in wearing her navy wool coat, the one with the brass buttons she'd had tailored decades ago. She didn't take it off right away. Miles Corwin rose from behind his desk, glasses slipping halfway down his nose. Eleanor, he said warmly. Good to see you. She nodded, but there was no small talk. She placed a folder on the desk and sat down with the precision of a woman used to leading classrooms, not indulging delays. I want to restructure everything, she said simply. All assets, all titles, every account that still has my name. Miles looked down at the folder, then opened it. Neatly labeled tabs, a printed ledger, a handwritten page, titled Extracted Without Thanks. His brows lifted slightly. This is thorough. I've been thorough my whole life, she said. It's time that meant something. Miles turned to his laptop and began typing. And the goal? Legal insulation, Eleanor said. Trust-based, irreversible. I want what's left of my legacy to outlive entitlement, not fund it. He didn't blink. You've come prepared. I've been preparing for 47 years. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. He leaned back and studied her for a moment, then picked up the phone. Then let's bring in Deidre. Deidre Platt entered like a scalpel and heel. Crisp blouse. No jewelry. A fountain pen instead of a tablet. She offered Eleanor a nod that felt like respect rather than sympathy. I've read your notes, she said. We'll begin with asset separation. Split holdings from liquid and initiate a blind trust for long-term distributions. Eleanor tilted her head. Amber and Logan? Deidre didn't flinch. We'll remove them from all pay-on-death accounts. Immediately. She reached for the forms in her folio. You'll need to list a new primary and contingent beneficiary, and a legal proxy. Eleanor looked down at the blank lines, then reached into her purse and pulled out a note card she'd already prepared. Medical and financial proxy. Helen Ford, she said. Full authority. Miles looked surprised but not confused. Your best friend. My actual family, Eleanor replied. The pen moved across the pages without hesitation. Signatures here, initials there, one document required a thumbprint. She pressed firmly, no smudges. Deidre slid the final agreement forward. This officially creates the Eleanor Quinn Protective Trust. No inheritance is assumed. No contest can override it. Eleanor exhaled, not relief, not triumph, just release. Like someone who had finally finished grading the last paper of the year and was ready to file the red pen away. The door opened behind her. Helen stepped in with her usual half-scowl and a silk scarf knotted at the throat like armor. She took one look at the forms and one look at Eleanor, then sat without being asked. So, she asked. Eleanor turned the folder toward her. Everything's moved. Every last account. Helen nodded. Once. And I named you, Eleanor said, sliding the proxy form forward. Helen stared at it, then at her. Something old and soft blinked behind her eyes before she covered it with a sharp breath through the nose. You're finally cutting the bloodline, she said. No, Eleanor said quietly, tucking the pen back in her purse. I'm pruning what doesn't bloom. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the leaves into small spirals. Inside, Miles pressed save one final time. Deidre closed her folio with a satisfying snap. Eleanor stood, her coat still buttoned. No more dinners, no more Tupperware, no more guilt budget, only balance, and the slow surgical restoration of something far more personal, sovereignty. The morning sun cut across Eleanor's kitchen table, warm but sharp. She was slicing apples for a tart when her landline rang, the one only a handful of people still had. Helen didn't say hello. You need to see what your daughter just posted. Eleanor wiped her hands and crossed to her tablet, sliding her glasses on as she opened the app. Amber's profile still featured a photo from Logan's high school graduation. His cap was crooked. Eleanor remembered fixing it right before the picture. Now it sat frozen in time, next to a new post, time-stamped 10 minutes ago. Managing Mom's decline is hard. Pray for us. Just trying to do what's best before it's too late. Eleanor stared at the screen. The post had 24 likes. A comment from someone Amber hadn't seen since college read, "Thinking of you, caregiving is so hard." Her hands didn't shake, not yet. She opened her planner, turned to a page already marked with a blue paperclip, and dialed the number beside it. Dr. Minna, she said once the receptionist answered, I'd like to schedule that cognitive assessment. Today, if possible. By 3:00 p.m., she was sitting upright in the exam room. Every question met with calm precision. Serial sevens, world recall, clock drawing, abstract reasoning. The doctor leaned back at the end, impressed. I've seen 60-year-olds struggle more. Eleanor smiled, faint but steady. Put it in writing. I'll need it notarized. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Eleanor had invited Logan and Amber, not out of hope, but for documentation. She made pot roast. Logan picked at the meat, glancing now and then at his phone. He'd brought his laptop, uninvited, and plugged it in at the dining table like it was a hotel lounge. Eleanor sipped her tea, the recorder tucked in her apron pocket, already rolling. Logan leaned back mid-meal, stretching, then glanced toward the muted television in the den. Why do you always have those ancient shows on? He said with a laugh. Like, is Murder, She Wrote supposed to keep your brain alive, or are you just prepping for the crime scene? He cackled at his own joke. Amber didn't even glance up from her phone. Eleanor said nothing. She tapped her teacup once against the saucer, a habit from decades of classroom signaling. 2 nights later, Helen stopped by with lemon bars. She walked through the kitchen as Eleanor filed away medical papers, still in their crisp envelope. They were on the porch when I got home, Eleanor said. Dr. Minna included 3 originals, notarized, as requested. Helen nodded. Amber's ramping up. Eleanor looked up. She's been calling around, Helen continued. I overheard her talking to that smug realtor at church, the one who helped list her last condo. She said she's planning to suggest assisted living before the holidays, wants it to sound merciful. Eleanor set the medical file in a new folder, labeling it in clean print. Capacity, confirmed. She'll be shocked, she said dryly, when I suggest legal suffocation instead. The doorbell rang. It was a courier, manila envelope, return address stamped from Miles Corwin's office. Eleanor signed, stepped back inside, and opened it. Inside were copies of the updated trust structure and a letter of confirmation, all accounts sealed, all proxies established, all directives legally binding. A post-it in Miles's handwriting rested on top. This protects everything. She left the envelope on the table, standing in silence, as Helen poured 2 glasses of iced tea. Outside, the porch light flickered against the coming dusk. Inside, Eleanor pressed play on the audio file from dinner. Logan's laugh crackled through the tiny speaker, followed by his words, clear, smug, ignorant. Her shows might be old, but she wasn't. The brochure came by mail, glossy and unsolicited. A beige envelope addressed in script so cheerful it felt passive-aggressive, promising compassionate long-term solutions and community-based cognitive care. Eleanor unfolded it at the kitchen table, where sun lit the edges of her favorite mug. Inside, full-color spreads of common rooms with throw pillows. Smiling residents gathered around puzzles. One woman mid-laugh held a therapy bunny like a prop. Tucked in the corner was a post-it, unmistakably Amber's handwriting. Just consider it. Love, A. Eleanor picked up the phone. Not the landline this time. Her private mobile reserved for the few who hadn't mistaken silence for surrender. Hi, she said to the receptionist. I'd like to cancel my tour next Thursday. Yes, that one. She didn't explain further. The following morning, she sat across from a woman with close-cropped gray curls and a blazer pin that read Hope is Action. Her name was Director Mae Jensen, and her nonprofit helped women transition out of domestic crisis. They needed a satellite location, quiet, residential, safe, but zoning had always been the issue. Eleanor slid a folder across the table. My house is zoned, 3 bedrooms. Quiet, street, good bones. Mae looked stunned. You'd live there with them. Eleanor shook her head. No, I'd gift the house outright, but only under 2 conditions. It stays residential, and it stays alive. Mae's eyes shimmered. You're serious? Eleanor nodded. There are enough dead spaces dressed as nursing homes. I want mine to feel like it's still breathing, even when I'm not. By the end of the week, she had walked the safe house prototype, a former bungalow turned sanctuary. Light filtered through gauzy curtains. Kids' shoes lined the front hallway. One of the women was trimming rosemary by the back steps, humming something old and familiar. Eleanor stood there a long time, breathing it in. The next day, Miles Corwin cleared his schedule. This isn't a standard estate plan, he said after she'd laid out her vision. No, she agreed. It's a transfer of energy. He nodded once, then reached for his pen. Behind him, Deidre Platt stepped in with a new binder, labeled the Quinn Residential Legacy Trust. Bypassing heirs will cause friction, she warned gently, flipping to the draft clauses. But if this is filed under charitable conversion with irrevocable terms, it can't be undone. Eleanor was already signing. Miles looked over. I'll initiate the deed transfer this week. And the house? Deidre smiled faintly. It becomes a living trust, legally untouchable, tax deductible, and fully exempt from probate access. Helen arrived with a bag of pears and 2 envelopes, one from her pension review, the other from her old union, still sending updates. She raised a brow at the papers spread across the dining table. So this is the part where you donate your bones to science. Eleanor passed her the new trust document. Helen skimmed it, pausing only at the bottom. Then she let out a low whistle. You're about to become the inheritance they never saw coming. Eleanor shrugged. They wanted me gone. They thought you'd shrink, Helen said. You expanded. Outside, wind stirred the trees. Across the street, Amber's car pulled into the curb briefly. She didn't come in. She left a package, probably another brochure, and drove off before anyone could ask questions. Eleanor watched from the window. I'm not taking their tour, she said aloud. Helen handed her a pen. That's good, because you're about to give one. Amber had insisted on a neutral location. She chose the conference room at the co-working space she occasionally used for client pitches, glass walls, filtered water, mediocre coffee. The kind of place meant to project professionalism, while hiding the panic behind the PowerPoints. Eleanor arrived precisely at 10 hour, wearing her gray wool coat buttoned high, pearls at her neck. Helen walked beside her, unhurried. Deidre Platt followed, carrying a slender black folio and a tablet already unlocked. Amber blinked when she saw them, just for a moment. Then she stood, smile forced. I thought this would be just us. Eleanor slid into the seat opposite her, folding her gloves and setting them calmly on the table. That's exactly what this is. Amber tried to recover. I wanted to talk through options. Long-term care, property transition, maybe even start discussing power of. You already did, Eleanor said, voice gentle but surgical. On Facebook, with emojis. Amber flushed. Deidre opened her folio and laid out a bound summary with Eleanor's name embossed in silver. This meeting is to clarify asset positioning, she said crisply. All points of fiduciary interest have been transferred. Amber stared at the packet, but didn't touch it. Transferred where? Deidre flipped to the second page and turned it toward her. Not to you. Helen poured herself a coffee from the thermos she'd brought, and leaned back, watching. Amber's face pinched. Excuse me? No accounts, Deidre said, flipping another page. No pay-on-death designations. No medical or financial proxy authority. All of it separated, protected, finalized. Amber's voice rose. What about the estate? A soft chime interrupted. The wall-mounted monitor behind them blinked to life. Miles Corwin's face appeared calm and centered. Good morning, he said. Just here to confirm everything that's been said. Amber turned. What is this? A takedown? It's an update, Miles said smoothly. The estate has been fully restructured. The home has been deeded into a charitable trust. All legal proxies have been reassigned. All directives are locked. Amber's mouth opened, but no sound came. Helen finally leaned forward. This is what happens when you confuse inheritance with entitlement. Amber snapped. You don't get to talk to me like that. I just did, Helen said. And you're welcome. Amber turned to Eleanor, voice now sweetened with insult. Mom, you're not thinking straight. This isn't you. This is manipulation. Eleanor looked at her daughter with a calm so steady it felt prehistoric. I taught third grade for 31 years, she said softly. Do you really think I don't recognize a tantrum? Amber's face crumpled, fury threatening tears, but she didn't cry. Not in front of Helen. Not with Deidre watching, like a hawk in silk. I just wanted to plan, she hissed. Eleanor nodded, as if accepting a receipt. And this, she said, laying one final envelope on the table, is your last line item. Amber stared at it. Consider it, Eleanor added, rising from her chair. Your final budget adjustment. Miles gave a small nod from the screen. Deidre snapped the folio shut. Helen finished her coffee. Amber didn't open the envelope. She just sat there, watching them leave, her reflection staring back at her in the glass wall, framed by nothing but empty chairs. Outside, the sun had shifted. The wind lifted a row of campaign flyers from a nearby table, scattering them across the sidewalk, like confetti. Eleanor buttoned her coat. Behind her, Helen murmured, So, what's next? Eleanor didn't pause. Receipts, she said, and walked on. By Monday morning, Amber had gone public. Not to Eleanor's face, of course. That would require something braver than a keyboard. Instead, she took to Facebook, where filtered selfies and performative compassion made perfect camouflage for cowardice. Her post was long. Some of you have asked why I've been distant. it began, paired with a stock photo of clasped hands over a hospital blanket. It's been a hard season. My mother is in decline, and unfortunately being influenced by individuals who do not have her best interests at heart. We're trying to love her through it. Please respect our privacy and pray for clarity in this difficult time. It took less than 5 minutes for the reactions to start. Praying. So sorry. Hang in there. A heart emoji from her old Pilates coach. A sending hugs from someone who once confused Eleanor for a babysitter at Logan's school. Eleanor read it twice, then opened her scanner app. She pulled out the notarized statement of cognitive capacity from Dr. Minna's office. Her signature was clean, so was the doctor's. The psychological scores were off the charts. She scanned it in full, saved the file, and uploaded one page as a public response. No caption, no comment, just facts. The silence that followed was louder than Amber's post, and then, slowly, beautifully, the comments began shifting. Linda Halperin, wait, Eleanor taught my son 5th grade. She was sharper than the principal. Daryl Ross. She helped us with zoning laws 3 years ago, still quoted municipal code from memory. Rhonda Ellis, I saw her do the crossword in pen at the diner last month. Helen, never one to miss a public opportunity, joined the thread and typed, manipulation isn't handing over bank statements, it's asking for them. Amber didn't reply, but within an hour her post was deleted, and within 2, her entire profile vanished. No more filtered yoga photos, no more church group selfies, no more curated grief. Eleanor sipped her tea as Helen leaned over the tablet. Well, Helen muttered, if silence is golden, that was platinum. Eleanor didn't speak. Her eyes were already on a different screen. Someone had tagged her in a thread about Logan. A blurry paparazzi-style shot snapped outside a vape shop near campus. He was half leaning against a rental scooter, puffing like a dragon, and wearing a hoodie that read in block white letters, Trust Fund Baby. The irony wasn't subtle, nor was the caption someone had added beneath the photo. Guess we know who's not paying tuition this fall. Helen chuckled. Karma's got good aim this week. But Eleanor's gaze was quiet, studious. She clicked save on the image and filed it in a folder labeled Narratives. They chose. By evening, the conversation around town had changed. The whispers in the grocery aisle now favored curiosity over judgment. Her neighbor rang the bell just to drop off a pie for strength. Even the mailman offered an extra nod as if to say good for you without the word. Amber's silence stretched. Logan didn't call, but Eleanor wasn't waiting anymore. She was documenting and filing and preparing, because in her experience, those who try to rewrite the ending rarely survive the footnotes. And Eleanor had just opened a fresh journal. The printer in Miles Corwin's office hummed like an old hymn. Pages slid out one by one, each bearing the weight of finality, witness lines, legal references, trust language not even grief could untangle. Miles placed the last sheet on the stack, tapped the corners straight, and pressed the gold notary seal like a stamp of quiet rebellion. Amber Quinn and Logan Grady, officially removed from Eleanor's last will and testament. It wasn't vengeance, it was vacuuming, cleaning up the residue of people who had mistaken her love for leverage. Helen picked up the envelope that afternoon, flat, thick, and heat-sealed. She didn't ask what was inside. She didn't need to. The label said, enough. Final disposition. Quinn estate revision. She delivered the first copy to the manager at Eleanor's bank, the second to the records desk at Dr. Minna's office. Both clerks scanned the document with the brisk professionalism of people used to transitions, not knowing this one had a pulse. When Helen returned, Eleanor was upstairs, not knitting or reading, but simply sitting with the light angled across her writing desk and a tea towel draped over her lap like an old ritual. She was watching from the second-story window. Logan had arrived 20 minutes prior. His car, a beat-up silver sedan with a Support Local Artist sticker, was parked crookedly across the curb. He didn't knock gently. He pounded. He rang the bell 3 times. Then again, then tried calling her cell once, twice. Eleanor didn't move. From behind the sheer curtain, She watched him shift from urgency to irritation. He kicked a loose stone near the planter. He sighed dramatically and pulled his phone out, texting what was probably a monologue of manufactured remorse. Then, as if remembering who he was supposed to be, he called out, "Grandma, I just want to talk." Eleanor closed the curtain by 1 inch. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Downstairs, the front door stayed locked. She remained still until she heard the car start again, engine coughing once before rolling down the block like a defeated parade float. Only then did she descend. Helen had placed the now stamped documents on the sideboard. "I didn't read them," she said, "but I left the paperweight on top in case you needed to feel the heft." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't touch them either. Instead, she opened the desk drawer and pulled out a clean notepad. Not the one labeled legal or records or even correspondence. This one was blank. She wrote slowly, deliberately, not to Logan, not to Amber, but to herself. "This is not revenge. This is reclamation. You don't need their understanding. You need your breath back. Closure is not a key they hand you. It's the latch you seal from your side. You are not abandoning them. You are exiting the role they abandoned first." Each entry went into a separate envelope, dated, labeled personal archive, tucked inside a locked drawer Eleanor hadn't used since Mark died. Later that night, a secure notification pinged her inbox. "Trust Quinn Residential Legacy. Now irrevocable. Confirmed." Eleanor stared at the screen. Not with sadness, not with triumph, just stillness. She clicked archive, then opened the window again. The wind had shifted, softer now. Helen stepped in behind her, arms folded. "He looked pale," she said, "like someone who just found out the faucet runs dry." Eleanor turned slowly, then let him thirst. She reached for her cardigan and a pen, because there was still more to record, and this time, no one else would hold the narrative. It was Deidre who found it, buried deep in an old financial folder Eleanor hadn't opened since the Obama administration, a stack of student loan documents, slightly yellowed and still bearing Eleanor's co-signer's signature in precise teacher cursive. Attached to them was a line of credit Logan had used for emergencies, which apparently included concert tickets, rental scooters, and a failed t-shirt startup called Mood Swings. "Did you know these were still open?" Deidre asked, tilting the binder so Eleanor could see. Eleanor studied the papers without blinking. "I forgot," she said quietly. "He never did." The interest had bloomed like mold, quiet, stubborn, and legally attached to her. She sat back. "Let's clean it." Deidre nodded, already opening a form on her tablet. "We'll initiate an identity release and debt severance filing. But there's a more poetic route." Eleanor looked up. "We pay it off," Deidre explained, and then reassign the debt to him directly. "It won't undo the past, but it will make sure the future knows whose signature belongs on it." By noon, the transaction was filed. By 5 p.m., Logan's credit score had imploded like a sinkhole. The apartment application he'd submitted just hours earlier was auto-rejected. He didn't even get a call, just a denial email with the phrase "insufficient financial standing" highlighted in red. That night, Eleanor's landline rang once, then again, then again. She let it, but at 7:42 p.m. her cell buzzed. "Amber," Eleanor answered with a calm that only years of classroom discipline could maintain. "You vindictive old woman." Amber screamed. "He got denied for his lease. He's been humiliated. What did you do?" Eleanor turned toward the window. The street outside was soft with evening haze, a cyclist rolling past like punctuation. "I gave him something he never noticed," she said. "Responsibility." Amber was still shrieking when Eleanor ended the call. No dramatics, no raised voice, just a quiet click. Helen arrived not long after, carrying a lemon pie and a 6-pack of sparkling lemonade. "They're imploding," she said cheerfully, setting the drinks on the table. "Amber's been blowing up Facebook Messenger, like it's a hostage situation." Eleanor handed her a chilled glass. "Then this feels like a celebration." They clinked bottles. "To ghosted accounts," Helen said. "To the guilt budget," Eleanor replied, and they sipped like old war generals after a final battle. Later, Eleanor returned to her desk. She pulled out one of the envelopes labeled Personal Archive and added a new note. He asked me once what legacy meant. It's not what you leave behind, it's what you refuse to carry forward. She tucked it in carefully. Outside, the porch light flicked on automatically, bathing the steps in soft gold. Her laptop chimed with a confirmation. Debt transfer. Complete. Beneficiary. Logan Grady. Status active. There would be fallout. There always was when people realized their safety net had teeth. But Eleanor wasn't bracing for the storm. She was documenting it, and already plotting the next revelation, because Logan had taken more than loans, and the next account Eleanor would close wasn't financial. It was historical. Eleanor first heard about the plan from the mail carrier. Well, your daughter's been busy, he'd chuckled, holding out a delivery slip. Said she might start moving boxes into her son's garage. Said she needed space while you, quote, sort things out. He didn't mean harm, but the smile faded when he saw Eleanor's face still. Is that not happening? She took the slip without answering, closed the door gently. By afternoon, Deidre was already filing a cease and desist. No physical assets, no boxes, no mail forwarding or account linkage. No transfer of burden disguised as help, no presumption of estate inclusion. Eleanor signed it with steady hands. Not angry, just surgical. Helen arrived the next morning with gloves and her old cleaning jumpsuit. We doing the attic? She asked, eyeing the steep pull-down stairs like a soldier facing high ground. Eleanor nodded. Time to take inventory of what matters. The attic had always been a quiet place. Dusty but organized. The bins were labeled in neat print, Mark's tools, summer decorations, Logan's art projects, Amber's dance trophies. Eleanor opened each one, not with sadness, with clarity. From the box marked heirlooms, she pulled out a porcelain vase that once belonged to her grandmother, gently cracked at the rim, but still whole. She ran her fingers along the curve once, then wrapped it in a soft towel and placed it in a separate container labeled Donation, Women's Shelter. Why not keep it? Helen asked from behind a stack of quilts. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a pair of vintage opera glasses, the ones Mark bought at a flea market, their second year of marriage. They hadn't gone to the opera in decades. I'd rather it be used, she said finally, than shelved for people waiting on a will. Helen nodded and didn't press. 3 hours later, the attic had changed. No more sentiment stacked like obligation, just clean corners and carefully labeled boxes waiting for pickup by the museum archive van and the shelter coordinator. Only one thing Eleanor carried downstairs, a small chest cedar-lined and locked with a brass latch. Inside were her journals, 57 volumes, all hand-labeled by year, some leather-bound, others simple paperbacks. No dramatics, just Eleanor. Day by day, she placed the chest under her bed, then went to the kitchen and made 2 cups of peppermint tea. They were still sitting in the quiet when Helen's phone buzzed. Helen read the message, then looked up with raised brows. Logan just filed a complaint. Eleanor didn't flinch. Claiming mental cruelty, Helen added, and undue emotional hardship due to family estrangement. Deidre responded within the hour. One sentence. No claim can be built on revoked inheritance, especially one never promised. By sunset, Logan's attorney had formally withdrawn. Too much noise, not enough merit. At the same time, Eleanor received an email from the Historical Society thanking her for the donation of the 1920s wedding veil and her mother's diary. We'll display it during our exhibit on women's legacy, they wrote. It deserves to be remembered for strength not stored away. That night, Eleanor opened her own journal. Today, I exited a room they never noticed I built for them. They brought boxes. I brought finality. They drafted stories. I filed facts. They arrived with assumptions. I left with my name. She signed it, dated it, and placed it beside the others. A soft knock echoed downstairs, not forceful, not angry, just a quiet, uncertain tap. Eleanor didn't move. Helen looked toward the stairs. Eleanor shook her head. They'll find the door locked. Helen waited. Then what? She asked. Eleanor smiled faintly, her voice low and certain. Then they'll learn exit signs don't face inward. Eleanor sat at the dining room table, pen in hand, a fresh legal pad in front of her. Not the ivory paper she used for birthdays, not the stiff stationery, reserved for thank you notes. This was plain, lined yellow, unapologetic. Utility over sentiment. Are you sure you want to write it now? Helen asked, placing a ceramic mug of nettle tea beside her. Most people don't draft these until it's too late. Eleanor finished. Yes, that's why I'm doing it now. She didn't mean it dramatically. She meant it like she did most things, premeditated, practical. Her handwriting was neat but firm, a retired teacher's script, every loop and bar intentional. Eleanor June Quinn, born 1944, died eventually. She read books cover to cover, owned exactly one television, and preferred correspondence to confrontation. She taught third grade for 3 decades and remembered every name. She was preceded in passing by entitlement, performance, and the idea that legacy is inherited instead of earned. Helen raised an eyebrow. You're going to cause a firestorm. Let them burn, Eleanor said, scribbling a note in the margin. She paused over the family section, the line where one might list loving daughter Amber or beloved grandson Logan. She left it blank. Instead, she wrote, survived by friends who showed up uninvited with pie, survived by her own breath, survived by Helen Ruth Spencer, Ali co-conspirator witness, and in the final paragraph, she added one more name, carefully. To Sadie Ruth Spencer, age 10, the first child to say you smell like books, as a compliment. An education fund is established in your name. Helen blinked. She's going to scream. Good, Eleanor replied. Let her scream into her own silence. They both signed it. Eleanor in pen, Helen in pencil. So I can deny involvement later, she joked. 2 days later, Deidre met Eleanor at the bank. The safe deposit box was small, rarely accessed, and had recently been updated with biometric access restrictions. Logan had tried to override it earlier that morning. Failed facial recognition, failed password, no secondary authorization. He got as far as the hallway, the branch manager told Deidre, then started rambling something about emotional duress. We offered him a brochure and called security. Inside the box were only 3 things: Eleanor's wedding ring, a sealed flash drive, and the notarized obituary draft in a plastic sleeve. She returned home, poured herself a glass of apricot cider, and sat by the window. That's when the foreclosure listing popped up on her tablet. Quinn Residence, pending auction, 4-bed, 3-bath, default status. Bank managed, no estate lien available. Amber had assumed she'd be rescued, assumed the woman she once called a burden would somehow become a bailout. Eleanor didn't smile. She simply picked up her keys. She drove the old Buick slowly, hands at 10 and 2 passing the rows of manicured lawns, until she reached the cul-de-sac with the fading hydrangeas. Amber's house sat slumped, like a play pretending not to be over. A for sale sign stood crooked in the grass, red letters bleeding like embarrassment. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the window, a couch on the porch. No voices, no laughter, just a silent hush of consequence. Eleanor didn't stop, didn't honk, didn't wave, didn't gawk. She passed the house like a landmark she'd once lived near, but never within. By the time she turned the corner, the mailbox disappeared in her rear view, and in her purse the obituary waited. Signed, stamped, unread. The courtroom was cooler than expected. Not cold, but indifferent, like it had heard every type of family tragedy before, and no longer made room for outrage. Eleanor sat quietly at the petitioner's table, spine straight, cardigan neatly buttoned, a worn leather notebook resting in her lap. Amber sat opposite her, swaddled in retail grief, black dress, oversized sunglasses she didn't remove even indoors, and a tissue crumpled in her palm, like it had survived something. Her lawyer, a man Eleanor suspected was found on a discount legal site, shifted nervously beside her. The judge entered. Eleanor didn't stand until she had to, Miles Corwin, for the respondent, he said calmly, handing over a slim, stapled folder to the clerk. All documentation regarding property transfers, revised trust allocation, and advance medical directives, chronologically organized. Notarized. Amber's lawyer opened his mouth. Miles didn't look at him. He simply said, pages 11 through 17 contain signed statements, banking logs, and a notarized severance of inheritance dated 4 months prior to this petition. The plaintiff has no standing. The judge blinked once, then flipped open the file and skimmed. It took less than 2 minutes. He set it aside with a sigh that felt older than the court itself. Case dismissed. With prejudice. Amber lurched forward. Your Honor. But the gavel was already down. The bailiff didn't need to speak. He just nodded toward the back of the room. Eleanor remained seated a moment longer. Not from triumph, just exhaustion. Then she rose, adjusted the strap of her purse, and stepped into the hallway as if leaving a dentist's appointment, not a family funeral. Amber was already there, collapsed into a bench like a failed actress mid-rehearsal, her sobs thin and unconvincing. Her lawyer stood awkwardly at a distance, fiddling with his phone, already mentally out the door. Eleanor didn't pause, didn't offer a look or a word, but Helen, walking just behind her, leaned in with a whisper only Amber could hear. You didn't raise a daughter, she said. You raised an audit. Amber's crying hiccuped into silence. Outside, the afternoon sun hit like irony, bright, clear, and indifferent to loss. In the parking lot, Dadra waited with a folder in hand, and a bottle of elderflower water she held like a trophy. Update came in during the hearing, she said, handing over the document. Final valuation of liquidated holdings. Eleanor opened it without ceremony. Total assets transferred to trust, $1.2 million. She didn't blink, just closed the folder. That's more than she ever asked for, Helen muttered. No, Eleanor said softly. It's exactly what she thought she was entitled to. They drove home with the windows down, wind curling through Eleanor's white hair like punctuation. She didn't speak, she didn't hum, just stared out the window, her fingers resting lightly on the folder in her lap. Later that night, she sat at her writing desk, opened her journal. Today I buried something without needing a casket. It screamed, demanded, wept, and still held out its hands. But I left the courtroom with everything it thought I'd lost. She paused, then added one last line. Grief is honest. Entitlement is loud. I can live with grief. She signed it, dated it, and placed it beside the others. In the darkness her porch light blinked on again, but tonight it wasn't for visitors. It was just light. The renovations were nearly complete. What had once been a forgotten wing of the Willow Grove Women's Shelter was now sunlit, freshly painted, and warm with quiet anticipation. The scent of new drywall and lavender floor polish hung in the air, cut only by the murmur of distant conversations and the occasional hammer's echo down the hall. Eleanor stepped into the space that used to be her guest room, now reimagined as a private sanctuary. The floral wallpaper had been stripped, the window panes cleaned. A twin bed with hand-stitched linens rested in the corner, beside a sturdy dresser and a shelf lined with paperback. On the far wall, a small painting hung, Sadie's unmistakably hers, an abstract swirl of blues and greens, with a single crimson line cutting through the middle. It'll house 2 women transitioning out of crisis, the shelter director explained softly. They'll each have keys, dignity, and no debt to repay. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained on the painting. It's better this way, she said. Things should end in use, not storage. She met the women later that morning. One was named Renee, mid-30s, thoughtful, with a nervous way of tucking her braids behind her ears whenever spoken to. The other, Kendra, had a half-laugh that came out sideways, as though she wasn't used to hearing it in public. They didn't ask why Eleanor had donated the space. They just said thank you, and Eleanor, who had once raised a daughter who'd never learned the weight of those words, felt something loosen in her chest. Later that afternoon, Deidre texted from the bank. Sadie Ruth Spencer. Trust fund. First disbursement complete. Purpose, Tuition, Youth Arts Institute amount $118,500. Memo for the girl who smelled like books. Eleanor smiled at her phone, then opened her journal. Some family is written in ink and biology, others are drawn in breath, presence and permission. Today I chose mine with my eyes wide open. The landline rang once, a pause, then again, caller ID restricted number. She let it ring, then blocked it. A few minutes later, her laptop pinged with a push notification. Logan Grady deactivated account. No final post. No explanation. Just gone. Eleanor didn't react. She simply closed the tab. She reached for the folder marked Final Legacy Transfer and opened it slowly, like a letter long overdue. Inside were copies of every trust directive, museum deed, scholarship document and housing grant she'd signed in the past 6 months. Each one was initialed, notarized, executed. A clean sweep. She placed the final form on top, a formal addendum stating that no biological descendant retained any claim or connection to her estate, assets, or intellectual property. It was witnessed by Helen and signed in the ink Eleanor had reserved for retirement cards and wedding RSVPs. The doorbell rang. She stood, slow but steady, and walked down the hall, not rushed, not hesitant, just firm in her steps. At the door stood a young postal worker with a padded envelope. He smiled. Delivery for Miss Quinn. Thank you. She closed the door softly behind her and carried the envelope to the kitchen table. Inside was a photo. Renee and Kendra standing in front of the freshly painted room. Sadie's artwork hanging proudly in the background. In the bottom corner, someone had scrawled in blue pen, "This room gave me my breath back." Eleanor looked out the window as twilight settled like quiet punctuation. Her legacy wasn't waiting to be read. It was already living, and tomorrow she'd write something new. Eleanor had never liked surprise parties, so this one wasn't a surprise. The invitations had gone out 2 weeks in advance. Simple cream cardstock, with her old fountain pen ink across each envelope. Join me in celebrating a life not yet done. My 76th. No gifts, just present. The backyard looked different now, no longer trimmed with guilt or expectation. The garden had been revived with help from Renee and Kendra, raised beds brimming with basil, tomatoes and wildflowers. String lights zigzagged between the porch posts. Folding chairs circled the old maple tree. A long table held pitchers of herbal tea, a lemon layer cake and stacks of ceramic mugs, borrowed from the shelter. Guests arrived with laughter tucked in their pockets. Helen's granddaughter Sadie was first, wearing a sunflower yellow dress and clutching a box wrapped in butcher paper. Miles followed in a gray suit without a tie, handing Eleanor a bottle of hibiscus cordial. Deidre brought a clipboard, naturally, and a warm loaf of rosemary bread, still wrapped in foil. The women from the shelter arrived in 2s and 3s. Some wore fresh lipstick. One had curled her hair just for the occasion. They filled the yard with stories, with clinks of teacups and murmurs of gratitude, with the rustle of paper as guests slipped folded notes into a small cedar chest marked for Eleanor, to be opened later. Near the tree, Sadie stood on a small wooden stool and cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, but the hush that fell was immediate. "My name is Sadie Ruth Spencer," she said. "I didn't inherit land or jewelry or a famous last name, but I did inherit intention from someone who saw me long before the world decided who I should be." She paused, glanced at Eleanor, then added, "Some people inherit names, some inherit reasons." Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm, like a quilt being shaken out before bedtime. Eleanor's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She simply placed her hand on her chest, like she was trying to keep something in place. Helen raised her glass next. "I used to think Eleanor was cutting off blood," she said, "but I was wrong." A pause. She didn't cut it off. She bled it dry, then healed. Laughter spilled through the garden, sharp and knowing, but it halted just as fast. A loud engine, gravel crunching, then the slow swing of the front gate, followed by a familiar figure stepping forward in heels too high for the lawn. Amber. Her hair was flat-ironed, into submission, her lipstick too red. She clutched a designer tote like it might win her back entrance to a life she'd already lost. A security volunteer from the shelter, a quiet woman named Beth, stepped forward with calm authority. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This is a private event. I'm her daughter," Amber snapped. Beth didn't flinch. "And this is her boundary." They stood in silence. Two women, two definitions of presence. Eleanor didn't rise, didn't wave, just turned to Sadie and handed her another note for the memory box. Amber stood at the gate for several long seconds, then left. No scene, no speech, just silence trailing her like an unwelcome +1. As twilight stretched across the yard, candles flickered in mismatched jars. Someone strummed a guitar. The garden smelled of basil and cake and endings that tasted like peace. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, journal resting beside her like a second heartbeat. She looked at her guests, not relatives by blood, but by alignment, chosen, and she whispered, mostly to herself, "I'm still here." But in her heart, she knew what came next wasn't about being remembered. It was about being lived forward. The office was quiet, save for the slow hum of the ceiling fan and the shuffle of legal folders being stacked into neat piles. Eleanor sat at the polished oak table, her hands resting on the arms of a wooden chair that felt more like a witness box than a seat. Miles slid the last document toward her. "This one formalizes health proxy designation," he said gently. "And this," he placed a thin blue sheet atop it, "is your statement of final directives. All copies will be archived. You'll retain the master." Eleanor nodded once. Her signature was steady, confident, inked in the same deep green pen she used for grading papers back when her handwriting still decided futures. When the final folder snapped shut, Deidre looked up from her notepad. "Everything's where it belongs," she said. Miles extended his hand. "You've done more than most ever even consider." Eleanor took his hand and shook it firmly. "I've done enough." By the end of the week, the move was complete. Her new home was a weather-worn cottage tucked near the dunes of a Carolina shoreline, whitewashed clapboards, salt-stained shutters, and a porch that creaked under the weight of peace. Inside, a twin bed, a pine bookshelf, a kettle, and a record player that only played soft jazz and memory. She unpacked slowly. One chair, 2 mugs, 3 books. And her journals, 58 now, including the one she began last autumn. Helen came every Thursday. She brought a thermos of sweet iced tea and a deck of cards, always in the same cloth pouch with the embroidered daffodil. They played gin rummy as waves hissed beyond the porch, the rhythm of the game matching the tide. Sometimes they talked, other times they just let the silence settle. Sadie began managing the trust that spring. She came with spreadsheets and a highlighter tucked behind one ear, her voice confident in a way Eleanor had only ever heard in teachers and surgeons. She didn't ask permission, she gave updates. Scholarships approved, grants funded, programs launched under the quiet banner, the Quinn Initiative, Intention Before Inheritance. On a breezy morning in early June, Eleanor sat at her desk with the final journal open. She reread the pages slowly, all the entries, all the reckonings, all the revisions. Then, with the same pen that had signed away old ghosts, she wrote one final line: account closed, debt repaid, legacy redirected. She closed the journal, placed it on the shelf, and didn't look back. Outside, the sun tilted toward the sea, and the wind carried the faint sound of gulls and a child laughing somewhere down the beach. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a linen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and exhaled the kind of breath that lives between endings and beginnings. Her phone buzzed once. A new text from Helen. "Thursday games still on." Eleanor smiled. She didn't reply. She just reached for the deck of cards, and as the camera would pull wide past the porch, past the dunes, past the receding footprints of a long walk already taken, the final line would land, not as revenge, but resolution. "They called me a budget. I became the one line they never saw being erased.